On a crisp spring day in 1961, as cherry blossoms bloomed across Scotland, a baby girl was born, who would one day stun the world. Susan Boyle entered life as the youngest of 11 children, arriving when her mother Bridget was already 47 years old. The modest council house in West Lothian where she grew up wasn't filled with luxuries, but it overflowed with the melodies of her father's mining songs and her mother's gentle encouragement. While her 10 siblings gradually moved out into the world, Susan remained, absorbing the musical influences that would one day catapult her to stardom. Imagine a young girl standing by the coal fireplace, singing along as her father's weathered voice filled their small living room after his shifts in the mines. These were the moments that planted seeds of musical passion in Susan's heart, though no one, not even Susan herself, could have predicted how gloriously they would bloom decades later. The same humble council house that witnessed her childhood, songs would later be the home she'd return to, even after millions flowed into her bank account. Her story begins not with silver spoons or privilege, but with the authentic foundation of working-class Scotland, a foundation that would both ground her and give her the resilience to withstand the hurricane of fame that awaited her in the distant future. Susie Simple, the cruel nickname echoed through school hallways, following young Susan like a shadow that grew darker with each passing year. What her tormentors couldn't see, what no one understood, was that behind the quiet exterior and struggling academics was a mind wired differently. Not damaged as doctors had mistakenly claimed, but beautifully unique in its own right. Day after day, Susan would return home with tear-stained cheeks, having endured another round of mockery from classmates who couldn't comprehend why she processed information differently. Teachers compounded her suffering, wielding leather belts when her mind couldn't keep pace with their lessons. During seizures, which we now know were epileptic episodes, children would gather around her fallen form, pointing and laughing as she regained consciousness in a fog of confusion and shame. For decades, Susan carried the crushing weight of believing her brain was permanently damaged from birth complications, a narrative that shaped her self-perception and limited her horizons. The tragedy of misdiagnosis only fully came to light in 2013, when doctors finally identified her condition as Asperger's syndrome. "I always knew I was different, not less," Susan would later confide to journalists, her voice steady despite the pain of lost years. This revelation didn't just provide medical clarity, it rewrote Susan's understanding of herself, transforming a lifetime of perceived deficiency into a recognition of neurodivergent brilliance. Her undiagnosed condition hadn't been her downfall. In many ways, it had been the unique lens through which she experienced music with such profound emotional depth. The auditorium fell silent as an unassuming woman in a modest dress walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2008. Suppressed snickers rippled through the audience. Judges exchanged skeptical glances. "I'm going to sing I Dreamed a Dream," Susan announced, her Scottish accent thick with nerves but unwavering in determination. Then, in an instant that has now been viewed over 100 million times, everything changed. The first note escaped her lips, pure and powerful, and jaws collectively dropped. Simon Cowell's notorious smirk transformed into wide-eyed wonder. Amanda Holden's hand flew to her heart. The audience, the same people who moments before had been ready to dismiss this 47-year-old woman based solely on her appearance, rose to their feet in thunderous applause. This wasn't just a good audition. It was a cultural earthquake that shattered preconceptions in real time. The biggest wake-up call ever, Amanda Holden would later call it, a moment that forced millions worldwide to confront their own biases. Within days, Susan's performance swept across continents like wildfire. Hollywood celebrities from Demi Moore to Ashton Kutcher championed her on social media. The woman who had never been kissed, who had spent years caring for her ailing mother in obscurity, who had been rejected and ridiculed throughout her life, stood triumphant in the global spotlight. What makes this moment so eternally powerful isn't just the surprise of her talent, but the redemptive justice it represents. In those 3 minutes of song, Susan reclaimed her dignity and rewrote her story. The bullied became the celebrated, the overlooked became the unforgettable. And, in living rooms around the world, viewers were forced to ask themselves, how many Susans have we dismissed without a second glance? In the chilly November of 2009, record stores worldwide experienced something they hadn't seen in the digital age. Lines stretching around blocks, people of all ages clutching their money, eager to own a piece of musical history. Susan Boyle's debut album, aptly titled I Dreamed a Dream, wasn't just being released. It was erupting into cultural consciousness with volcanic force. The first week's sales figures left industry veterans speechless. Over 2 million copies worldwide, shattering records that had stood for decades. Amazon reported the highest pre-sales they had ever witnessed for any product. Billboard announced it as the highest first-week sales for a debut female artist since they began tracking in 1991. In a world supposedly dominated by auto-tuned pop stars and manufactured images, this 48-year-old Scottish woman with no formal training had just rewritten the rulebook. Behind these staggering numbers lay countless personal stories. The grandmother who hadn't bought music in 20 years but stood in line for Susan's CD. The teenager who discovered the emotional power of unprocessed vocals. The middle-aged woman who found in Susan the courage to pursue her own delayed dreams. Susan's voice wasn't just selling albums, it was striking a chord of authenticity in a world hungry for something real. The Guinness Book of World Records would soon document 3 separate achievements. Fastest-selling debut album by a female artist, highest first-week sales in the UK, and oldest person to reach #1 with a debut album. The music industry's marketing machine had nothing to do with this tsunami of success. This was purely the power of one authentic voice connecting with millions of hearts. And as Susan held her record-breaking album in her hands, perhaps the sweetest triumph wasn't the sales figures, but the knowledge that every person who had ever underestimated her was now witnessing her undeniable glory. As the first notes of Amazing Grace soared from Susan's lips on her sophomore album, The Gift, critics who had predicted a flash-in-the-pan career fell silent. The woman they had dismissed as a one-hit wonder was crafting a musical legacy that would span decades. From 2010 to 2019, Susan's artistic evolution played out in a series of albums that showcased not just her remarkable voice, but her growth as an interpretive artist. Someone to Watch Over Me in 2011 revealed her ability to bring new emotional depths to classic standards. After a brief hiatus to tend to personal matters, she returned with Standing Ovation, transforming legendary Broadway numbers into intimate conversations between artist and listener. Hope emerged in 2014, offering musical solace to a troubled world, while A Wonderful World in 2016 showcased her versatility across genres. But it was perhaps her 2019 album, simply titled 10, that best captured the essence of Susan's remarkable journey. Released exactly a decade after her meteoric rise, this collection celebrated not just the music, but the resilience behind it. Each track represented a milestone in a journey that had transformed a shy woman from a Scottish council house into a global phenomenon who had performed for queens and presidents. What makes Susan's musical evolution so compelling isn't just the commercial success, though selling over 25 million albums worldwide is certainly remarkable, but the authenticity she maintained throughout. In an industry that routinely pressures artists to reinvent themselves, Susan remained steadfastly true to her musical instincts. Her albums weren't crafted to chase trends, they were created to connect souls. And in recording studios from London to Los Angeles, producers accustomed to manufacturing hits instead found themselves humbled witnesses to a natural talent that needed no enhancement, just the space to soar. Behind the spotlights and standing ovations, Susan Boyle fought silent wars that her adoring fans could scarcely imagine. The seizures that had once made her a target for school bullies continued into adulthood, their sudden onset an ever-present fear as she navigated the demanding world of celebrity. The childhood epilepsy that had been misunderstood and mismanaged remained a challenge she faced with quiet courage. In 2013, as her third album climbed the charts, Susan received devastating news. Type 2 diabetes had taken up residence in her body. The simple pleasure of chocolate, her one small indulgence amid the whirlwind of fame, was now forbidden territory. For a woman whose life had been defined by limitations and restrictions, this new constraint seemed a particularly cruel twist of fate. The most frightening battle came in May 2022, when the stroke struck without warning. Her body, which had given voice to songs that moved millions, suddenly betrayed her. Words slurred, movements became uncertain, and the voice that had stunned the world temporarily lost its precision. "I thought it would be crazy to be back on stage," she later confessed after her triumphant return performance. "But I've done it." Few in the audience that night could comprehend the mountain of rehabilitation she had climbed. The painstaking speech therapy, the exercises to regain control of facial muscles, the psychological battle against fear that the next note might not come. What makes these health struggles so poignant is the stoicism with which Susan confronted them. There were no dramatic public announcements, no requests for sympathy, just quiet determination to overcome each obstacle. When she finally shared her stroke diagnosis after returning to the Britain's Got Talent stage, it wasn't to elicit pity, but to offer hope to others facing similar challenges. In Susan's world, even personal suffering became a gift she could share, proof that limitations need not define destiny. The moment Simon Cowell announced that diversity had edged out Susan Boyle for the Britain's Got Talent crown, something fractured within her. Cameras caught the brief flash of devastation crossing her face before the professional smile reasserted itself. What those cameras didn't capture was the internal collapse that would follow. The culmination of 5 weeks of relentless pressure, scrutiny, and expectation that her fragile nervous system could no longer bear. Within hours of the finale, the facade crumbled completely. Staff at the London hotel reported alarming behavior. A woman in profound distress, shouting that she hated the show that had made her famous, throwing water at a production assistant who attempted to calm her. By midnight, police were called. By morning, Susan Boyle, who less than 24 hours earlier had performed for millions, was being admitted to a mental health facility. Her breakdown now the headline rather than her talent. The British media regulator, Ofcom, considered a formal investigation into the show's producers. Had they sacrificed a vulnerable woman's well-being on the altar of ratings? Had anyone bothered to consider whether someone with Susan's neurodivergent processing and lifetime of isolation could withstand the hurricane of sudden fame? The inquiry was ultimately dropped, but the questions lingered. It was like an explosion in my head, Susan would later describe of those dark days. Everything I had known, my whole life routine, had been completely disrupted. Everyone wanted a piece of me, and I didn't know who I was anymore. The cruelest irony was that the very success meant to validate her worth had temporarily shattered her sense of self. What makes this breakdown so profoundly moving isn't just the vulnerability it revealed, but what came after. Susan didn't retreat permanently into obscurity as many predicted. Instead, she gathered the fragments of herself, sought appropriate treatment for her now diagnosed conditions, and gradually rebuilt not just a career, but a life on her own terms. In doing so, she transformed from victim to victor, using her experience to advocate for better understanding of mental health challenges and neurodiversity in the entertainment industry. When Susan's bank account swelled to millions, she did what anyone might expect. Purchased a beautiful new 5-bedroom house, a proper mansion compared to the modest council home where she'd spent her entire life. This was supposed to be the fairy tale ending, the underdog finally getting her palace. But fairy tales rarely account for the complications of real life. The dream home quickly became a nightmare. Local teenagers, perhaps jealous or simply cruel, began a campaign of harassment. Rocks shattered windows in the middle of the night. Flaming paper was pushed through her mail slot. Attempted break-ins left her terrified to sleep. The woman who had charmed the world found no charm in her new circumstances, only isolation and fear. One morning, without announcement, Susan packed essential belongings and returned to the council house where she'd grown up. The same modest home she'd shared with her mother until her death. The same address she'd listed on her Britain's Got Talent application. She gave the fancy new house to her niece and reclaimed the familiar surroundings that had witnessed her journey from obscurity to fame. This decision baffled the media and fans alike. Why would someone with $45 million choose to live in a humble, 4-bedroom council house? What they failed to understand was that for Susan, this wasn't a step backward, but a reclamation of authenticity. "I've never felt comfortable with the trappings of fame," she confided to a rare visitor. "This house knows who I really am." What makes this choice so powerful isn't just the rejection of materialistic expectations, but the wisdom it reveals. In a world obsessed with upgrading and upscaling, Susan recognized that genuine security comes not from luxury, but from the comfort of the familiar. The walls that had absorbed her childhood songs, witnessed her mother's encouragement, and sheltered her through decades of anonymity, now protected her from the disorienting aspects of celebrity. In choosing her childhood home over a mansion, Susan wasn't denying her success. She was ensuring it wouldn't deny her identity. Blood ties can be both anchors and chains, something Susan Boyle learned through bitter experience as fame reshuffled family dynamics with cruel efficiency. When her bank account expanded to millions, so too did the expectations of relatives, who suddenly saw her as an ATM rather than the sister they had previously overlooked. The most painful betrayal came from her brother Jerry. When his business faltered, Susan readily offered $75,000 to save it, a generous gesture from a sister, whose heart remained as open as her voice. But generosity creates dangerous precedents. Soon, Jerry allegedly threatened suicide if more money wasn't forthcoming, a manipulation that shattered Susan's trust. When she hesitated to provide additional funds, he retaliated with public accusations, painting her as a liar in the very tabloids that had once mocked her appearance. Amidst this fraternal warfare, Susan's sister Bridie remained her emotional lighthouse, the one sibling who had always seen Susan's worth before the world discovered it. When cancer took Bridie at age 73, Susan's grief was unfathomable. The sister who had defended her against childhood bullies, who had stood beside her through the tsunami of fame, who had kept her grounded when millions threatened to uproot her identity, was gone. The depth of this loss was compounded by Susan's inherent loyalty. She immediately stepped in to care for Bridie's daughter, adding caretaker responsibilities to her already complex life. Music projects were postponed, performances canceled, as Susan once again prioritized family over fame. What makes this family saga so touching isn't just the predictable drama of money-changing relationships, but the redemption that eventually emerged. In 2016, following Susan's public breakdown at Heathrow Airport, estranged siblings reunited at her bedside. Old resentments dissolved in the face of concern for the sister whose vulnerability reminded them of shared blood and history. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by the family that had fractured and reformed, Susan found perhaps her most meaningful success, not in record sales or standing ovations, but in the healing of wounds that fame had initially deepened. As the spotlight gradually dimmed, Susan Boyle crafted a life of remarkable ordinariness, punctuated by occasional performances that reminded the world of her extraordinary gift. The woman who once told Britain's Got Talent she'd never been kissed now harbors a sweet secret behind her shy smile. A long-term relationship with an American doctor whose identity remains protected from public scrutiny. Their love story began, simply, with casual conversations mentioned briefly to the Mirror in 2016. "Nothing serious," she said then, but time has deepened their connection into something meaningful enough that he accompanies her on special occasions like birthdays and holidays. Yet, unlike celebrities who leverage relationships for publicity, Susan guards this precious connection fiercely, refusing to parade it before cameras or discuss it in interviews. The life she's chosen might seem quiet to those accustomed to celebrity excess, attending her local Catholic church where she still sings in the choir, volunteering with elderly members of her community, enjoying simple pleasures like watching television with her cat. Yet within this simplicity lies profound contentment that eluded her during the height of fame. When asked about regrets, Susan mentions only one: not having children. "I'm not getting any younger," she once confided, the wistfulness in her voice revealing the one dream that success couldn't fulfill. Yet even in this acknowledgement, there's peaceful acceptance rather than bitterness. What makes Susan's current chapter so beautifully compelling isn't the dramatic arc of fame, but its gentle denouement. The woman who stunned the world hasn't disappeared. She's simply chosen to engage with life on her own terms. The voice that sold millions of albums now sings for the pure joy of it. Sometimes on international stages, sometimes in her parish church, always with the authentic passion that captivated us from the beginning. In a culture obsessed with constant visibility and relevance, Susan's retreat isn't failure, but wisdom. She understood what many celebrities never grasp: that fame is merely a chapter, not the entire story. And as she walks the streets of her Scottish hometown, occasionally recognized but largely left in peace, her quiet smile suggests she's found something far more valuable than applause. She's found herself.